Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network here this evening with author Alicia Menendez and Professor Joyce White Vance as they discuss the new book, The Likeability Trap. The Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network at NYU School of Law aims to remedy systemic inequities facing women in the legal profession through innovative leadership training and conversations like these. We're so looking forward to tonight's conversation. Before I turn it over to Professor Melissa Murray, the BWLN Faculty Director, a few logistics. If you haven't read the book yet, you can find a link to purchase it on our website, which we'll put in the chat later. And we will have time for questions at the end, so please submit questions in the Q&A box and we'll get to as many as we can. Over to Professor Murray for introductions.
Thank you, Abby. And thanks so much to all of you for joining us tonight. This could not be a more timely conversation. Over the last 3 weeks, we have witnessed the changing model of leadership in the United States as we've seen women take center stage, leading the House of Representatives, being members of Congress, and eventually swearing in the first woman vice president of the United States. It's truly been a heady couple of weeks, and there's been a lot to think about in terms of women's leadership. So I could not be more delighted that we are joined today for this incredible conversation with Alicia Menendez about her new book, The Likeability Trap. And I'm even more excited that the person who gets to lead this conversation with Alicia is a very dear friend, Professor Joyce Vance. Professor Vance is a distinguished professor of practice of law at the University of Alabama School of Law. She's also a legal contributor for NBC and MSNBC, and we have come to rely on her calm, consistent, knowledgeable demeanor explaining issues of law enforcement over the last 4 years. And she's the perfect person to do that explaining because for 8 years, from 2009 to 2017, she was the United States Attorney for the Northern District of Alabama. And in that position, she established Alabama's first ever civil rights division in the U.S. Attorney's Office. And we are absolutely honored and delighted to have her join us today for this conversation. So I will kick it over to you, Joyce. Welcome and thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me, Melissa, and for that embarrassingly warm welcome, which is actually the perfect lead into our topic, right? Today, we're here to talk about likability and women and how that affects us as leaders and as human beings. And I know we all have this tension in our lives between deciding whether or not we really are likable, whether we're really successful, or whether we're imposters in a sense. And as we listen to these introductions of ourselves, so often we're plagued with those sorts of questions. We are so incredibly lucky to have today Alicia Menendez to share with us her thoughts and her wisdom. This is a great book if you haven't read it yet. It's a book that I think we all need to read. I've just sent a copy to my daughter, Alicia, because it's so important for the time that we live in. So let me tell you a little bit about Alicia. She's an anchor for MSNBC. You can watch her show American Voices every weekend from 6 to 8 p.m. and you should do that. Alicia also has a podcast. It's called Latina to Latina, and it's very engaging. Another great way to hear her sense of what's going on in the world that we live in today. She's also the mom to 2 young girls. And while she's not an attorney, she tells me that she did take the LSAT, smart enough not to go to law school, and she can also recite many Law and Order episodes from memory, which is really impressive. And we may have to test that a little bit today because I'm a fan of the show. I have had the chance to be on the air with Alicia a few times, and her questions are always thoughtful and they're well-informed. You can tell that she's done her homework. So it's a little bit nerve-wracking to have a role reversal today and to be the one who's asking her the questions. I'm sort of looking forward to it, but I'm also terrified that I won't live up to your standard. But we'll just go ahead and jump right in so that we can have plenty of time at the end for your questions. Please do put them into the chat so we can get to all of them at the end. So let me ask you about a tweet that you have pinned on the show's account. It says this, it says, Vice President Kamala Harris shattered the glass ceiling this week. When she stood and raised her hand, droves of would-be future leaders stood up to take the oath with her, forever expanding America's definition of who a leader is. And that seems like a really great place for us to start. We've finally got the first woman vice president, a mere 232 years into our country's history. The first Black vice president, she has a South Asian heritage. It's just amazing. And she also seems to be likable. She seems really likable. She cooks. Her husband and her stepchildren adore her. She has this fabulous extended family. Her sister is always at her side. She's had the same best friend than she was a kid. And she looks like someone that you could sit down to have a serious policy conversation with. And at the end of the meal, you could seamlessly move on to asking her where she got the gorgeous necklace that she's wearing, right? She seems really likable. So given where we are in our history, and given the thoughts that you have in your book, which I think are as much about our lives in general as the concept of likability is about our careers, let's start off with a baseline so that everybody understands. What is it that you mean when you talk about the concept of likability?
Hi, Joyce Vance. I don't know that I like being on the other side of this any more than you like it. So we will reassess at the end. And
You can always ask me questions if you want to midway through.
Thank you. That would make me feel much better. Thank you to Melissa. You are the best. Thank you to everyone who's taking the time out at 6 o'clock at night to do this. If you hear screaming in the background, it is my two small children. They, do not appreciate that mommy has things to do. Likability is really hard to define, Joyce. That is part of the challenge of talking about it and writing about it, which is that it is wildly subjective. There are personality traits that tend to make someone more likable. Extroversion tends to make someone more likable. Conversely, being neurotic tends to be something that makes someone less likable. But the whole challenge with likability is that likability is in the eye of the beholder, and it is informed by both sides of the equation, both by the person who's being interpreted and the person who is doing the interpretation. It is informed by their gender, by their race, by their sexual orientation, by their geography, like everything changes. And that is part of why I worry that likability is often used as a cover for bias, that it's so easy to say, I don't know, Joyce, it's just not really my cup of tea. And we don't do always a good job of interrogating what we mean when someone says that they don't like someone. And that happens outside of the workplace. It happens in PTA meetings. It happens in social circles. There are stakes there. Where the stakes, I think, are really, really high is when you're talking about women in the workplace, specifically talking about ambitious women in male-dominated fields and women who are aspiring to ascend into senior management and beyond. That is when saying, I just don't like her, becomes deeply, deeply problematic.
So it's fascinating to position it in that place, right? I just don't like her. And I bet we've all experienced that. You talk early on in the book about how that happens and how it might be voiced, and really the different kinds of women who come into play. Share a little bit with us about how that sort of plays out.
Yeah, I mean, I will start by saying I am someone who cares deeply about being well-liked. That is what set me out on the path of writing this book. And I originally intended to write a book that was more like Eat, Pray, Love for likability, where I would do yoga and eat gelato and learn to care less about what people think of me. What I learned as I spoke with other women doing research for the book is that there were a lot of women, I'd say the majority of women, who fell into my camp, who do care very much about what other people think of them. That makes sense. Women and girls are socialized across cultures to care what other people think of them, to think of themselves in relation to other. I would argue that when kept in check, that can be an incredible quality, a strength, the fact that we are mindful of how our words and actions impact other people, how we make other people feel. The challenge is when you become dominated by that question of what other people think of you. What surprised me though, Joyce, is that in as much as there were a lot of women like myself, I also ended up speaking with a lot of women who did not give a damn about likability, who were very comfortable showing up as themselves all the time. And I, being a person governed by likability, imagined that those women were leading their best lives, that was where I was going to get to on the other side of this journey. And what I heard from them especially again, ambitious women in male dominated fields, is that they too felt that they were paying a price for being so brazenly themselves. That when they showed up as themselves, whether that was with warmth or with strength, they were dinged because they did not care. They were dinged because they were not rising to the expectation that a woman ought to care what other people think about her. And that core question became much more interesting to me than my own personal grapplings with this question. It would have been much easier to write a book about letting go and learning to care less, much harder to write a book about the structural and institutional challenges of this. To your question, the women on this call know this, and I'm going to guess that because we're talking about attorneys or people who aspire to be attorneys, the majority of you are getting feedback that you are too assertive, too aggressive, too much, need to tone it down. And that you have sort of everything it takes, but sometimes the way you communicate doesn't land, or sometimes the way you communicate is perceived as being too rough around the edges. And if you could just warm it up a little bit, then you would be unstoppable. There's also a lot of women out there who are being told that everybody loves them, they're the favorite person in the office, but people are just not sure they have what it takes to ascend, that they are not strong enough, that they don't take up enough space, that they don't take up enough oxygen. There are also a lot of women like myself who have been given both sets of feedback in different contexts, which shows you how context specific and subjective that feedback is, that a woman in the course of her career can both be too much and too little. My concern is that in giving women that feedback and focusing so much on the stylistic, that we, one, rob women of the opportunity to just show up as they are and get the job done and focus on results. And that we also then don't spend enough time talking about hard skills because we spend so much time talking about whether a woman should use her hands less or lower her voice.
And so this forms the essence of the likability trap, which is the central problem that you pose here. And I think that's a great layout of what the issue is. It's really fascinating to me. And you said this just a minute ago. You talked about the fact that it's easy for likability to act as a marker for bias. Not all bias is unfair, right? I mean, people might have an appreciation for some skills over others. But when it becomes a raw marker for gender bias, then we have a real problem. So talk about the components of the likability trap. What is it that people are really reacting to here? Is it malleability? Is it femininity?
It is that what we expect of women is for women to be warm and communal. And what we expect of leaders is for leaders to be well-versed in self-advocacy and assertion. And so what we're essentially telling women is that there is no way to show up the way we expect a woman to show up and to show up the way that we expect a leader to show up, that those things are mutually exclusive. I mean, of course they're not. You look even at Kamala Harris, there are women who have ascended this, but that means that when she does her confrontation with Joe Biden during the primary debate, she was dinged for being too aggressive, too assertive, unlikable. Clearly, in addition to there being the gender component of that, there was certainly a racialized, gendered component of that. You know, when all of them, I was so struck, this was maybe my favorite part of the last few months, was all of these women that were being considered for a vice president who would go on television, be asked about being considered, and they would say, yes, I'd love to, and let me tell you why I would be so good for this job. That is an incredible departure from 4 years ago, 8 years ago, when if you were asked that question, your job was to demur. And I think Stacey Abrams sort of set the standard for that, where she was like, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to tell you that I want it, and I'm going to tell you why I deserve it. And then you saw basically everyone else who was on that stage follow in suit. I loved that because we are not accustomed to seeing women do that. We're not accustomed to seeing women assert that they want something and then explain why they deserve something. And because we're not accustomed to that, when you see that in the microcosm of an office, it very often rubs people the wrong way. And it gets dubbed a lot of things. But the challenge for women there is that in order to ascend, you need to do that for yourself. You need to advocate for yourself. You will not get ahead by not doing that. But when you do that, you do pay a price very often in social capital. And so women, just every single move we make, we are determining how far we need to go without going so far that we cross a point at which we can no longer redeem ourselves. And then since you framed this around bias, I do want to say, because I brought it up, that in addition to all of the gender pieces, there are all these other pieces. So a Black woman who is assertive will be read as angry and aggressive. And the problem with anger outside of the obvious is that when women are marked as angry, they also get marked as less competent, which often then affects the wages they are paid or the seniority, which people think that they are, prepared for. With Latinas like myself, sort of fall into two different buckets, either this idea that we are meek, that we are, really nice and everybody feels warmly towards us, but we are not someone who needs to be taken seriously, or we're a Sofia Vergara on Modern Family, where we are passionate and ridiculous and over the top. And again, you might love to be with that person at a cocktail party, but you're not necessarily going to give that person the nuclear codes. And so we get marked those two ways. Asian American women get marked, there's an expectation that they will be submissive, which means that if you are on a team with a woman who is Asian American and she wants to take control of the team, that violates both your expectation of what you expected of a woman and what you expected of someone who is Asian American. And again, it's not that someone will say, excuse me, you are Asian American and this is not what I was expecting. No, because then you could walk over to HR and say, we have a problem. The problem is that this all plays out so quietly and so subtly so often that it is very often hard to know, am I running up against bias or am I running up against another set of limitations? And how do I even begin to articulate that, given that the way it is being articulated or reflected back to me is not so explicit?
I'd be willing to bet that you, like me, if we each had a quarter for every time during the primary that somebody said something to us, or during the vice president selection process, I know Stacey Abrams is smart, but there's just something about her. I just don't like her. And I thought discouragingly that was as likely to come from women as it was to come from men. So let's dig down on this question of bias for a minute. And I want to talk about one of the most powerful stories that I think you tell in the book. You talk about an empowerment event that you spoke at for teenage girls, my least favorite age group to have to engage with right now. And one of the tables of girls, you recall, wasn't as engaged as everybody else. And you asked them to start on a writing project, and this one table didn't. So you, and I think this speaks to your bravery, to be honest, you walked straight over to them to figure out why they were sort of blowing you off, and you asked them what was going on. And one of the girls at the table told you, likability is something white ladies care about to feel better about themselves. And you say that you had a friend, a Black woman, who reinforced that view with you. And you make a point here that I think is really important. You say that what you learned, and I'm going to quote from your book, is it is a privilege to not feel that your body and your existence in the world are things people reject. That's a really stunning revelation for people who haven't experienced it, but it is the everyday experience for women of color or for other people who are outside of the mainstream. So let's talk for a minute about this intersection of privilege and likability. And what does the landscape look like here?
Yeah, I mean, I'm so glad you brought this up. And part of what I was forced to contend with there is that while I do identify as Latina, my father is Cuban, I'm white. Racially, I am white. And so that means that I can move through the world in a variety of places, including the workplace, marked as a white person, which gives me certain privileges when it comes to safety and a whole host of other things. And in that moment, when that young woman said that to me, I sort of had to catch my breath, because she wasn't wrong. She was right. I mean, I think there were a lot of things going on there. She wasn't thinking in terms of ascension. She was thinking in terms of survival. I think there's a reality among Black women in all of the literature about the workplace. Black women are among the most ambitious women in corporate America. They are the women who say, no, I'm ready to be in charge and I can tell you why I'm in charge. They're also the most likely to feel just invisible. That there's a tension between being hyper visible, right? Being like the person who is pushed out in front and sort of showcased in these diversity events that very often organizations and corporations will force you to do, ask you to do, or just being looked over time and time again. And a big part of that is that if there is no one in upper management, senior management, who shares your life experience or who looks the way you do, then they may not totally get it. And they may not be willing to pull you up through the ranks the way that they are willing to do for someone who matches and has a similar background. So the bias shows up in a number of ways. I think the way that came up most often, especially with women who were middle senior, was this idea that very often you were in a setting, in a meeting, and something would happen. And in one case, I'm thinking about a Black woman who worked at a company, and as she described it, something racially charged was said in the course of a meeting. She, of course, like kept details so that she wouldn't expose her employer. And she flagged, she said, guys, this is what was just said was problematic. And I need to point out that it was problematic. And I need to explain why it was problematic. And almost instantaneously, the group of, let's say, 6 or 10 managers turned the conversation around, and the conversation became about the way that this woman raised the problem. So instead of grappling with the actual problem, she became the problem. And that was an experience that came up again and again and again when I spoke with Black women in particular, and a way in which I think they felt that a lot of other women in the workplace had failed them, had not stood beside them and said, before we jump to her tone, let's talk about the problem that she's actually flagging. Let's create space to talk about that before we begin policing the way that she raised this. And so it made me think a lot about both the ways this shows up, and then also the ways in which those of us who have any form of privilege, given that it's a sliding scale, choose to show up for each other.
You know, one of the most compelling aspects of the book is the storytelling. You talk to a lot of different people, you share their stories. I'm really curious, was it easy to get people to talk to you about likability and the issues that they experienced, or were people hesitant at first to discuss it with you?
Such a good question. I would say a thing I noticed is that I love interviewing women who are over 50. Women who are over 50 have sort of like figured a lot out. They figured out their personal narrative. They have figured out things about the workplace. They've not, especially if they are a person who who's found a leadership position in their field. I also find though, that sometimes when you interview those people, they have packaged their story so well that there is like a point of conflict, and then there is a neat and tidy resolution. And that is not really how life goes. That's not really how someone climbs through the career ranks. But the gamble that comes with admitting more than that, I think, is really hard. And so that was what was hard to get to, which was like someone who was both aspirationally where you'd want to be, who was willing to reveal the nitty-gritty messiness of how they got there. Because all of this carries penalties. I mean, admitting that your feelings were hurt carries a penalty. Admitting that you messed something up when women are constantly, our competence is constantly questioned, that carries a penalty. Like it is not, we don't have this space yet for women to say, this happened, it hurt my feelings, and this is how I dealt with it. When you tend to talk with professional women, it's very tidy. Nothing truly messy ever happens.
That makes so much sense to me, that people have packaged their stories because they have to do that to move on. And a big part of what you do is you unpackage it. And I think the most important thing we'll talk about today are some of the solutions that you have. I know that's what I want to hear about. But before we get there, let's just pull out some more threads about the nuances of the likability issues that you discovered talking with people. Are there geographic differences? Could physical appearance play a part in this? Is religion part of a likability trap? I mean, the obvious marker here is racial and ethnic prejudice, but what else carries over into this area?
Motherhood is huge. And motherhood and I tip the funny thing about writing a book like this is you are so bound by what the social scientists have chosen to research and the way that they have chosen to slice and dice their own research. And most often they're working with small sample sizes of women, much less ethnic or racial minorities, much less religious minorities. But motherhood was a big one. And part of what I found so interesting is that they really measured it against parenthood, right? They really looked at, are dads running into some of the same penalties that moms are running into? So there's a study that really upsets me, but that I think is critical, which is they did this study where you had a woman at her desk at work and she was working and she would get a call that said, your kid just threw up on the playground. You have to come pick them up. And so the woman has the choice between staying at work and saying, I'm going to send someone else to pick up my kid, or I'm going to run out the door, not finish the project that I'm on, and promise to finish later. And what they found was that when women would rush out the door, they were dinged for not being committed to their work. And when they chose to stay, they were dinged for being an incompetent mother. They were judged either way. Conversely, when they did the same experiment with men, if a man ran out the door, they were like, what a great dad. And if the man stayed at work, they were like, thanks so much for being a team player. And that it really was unique to being a woman, that motherhood dialed up all of the elements of femininity for which women are often perceived as being less competent or less leaderly, and it put them into focus. And women were less likely to get stretch assignments. I mean, and what is interesting to me about motherhood is that unlike race or ethnicity or the things that are fixed, here was a thing where I personally had a before and an after. I remember my life before being a mother, and I remember the perceptions I had of other mothers in my office, and that I would see them sometimes leave at 4 or 4:30, and I'd be like, oh, what I wouldn't give to be Claire, how great it is that she gets to leave at 4:30. I now understand Claire is going to her second job, so then she, when she's done with her second job, can go and finish the other job. I mean, I believe I am an empathetic person, and motherhood helped me understand the limits of my own empathy and the limits of each of our ability to imagine the other, that in as much as we can believe we are putting ourselves in someone else's shoes, that is nearly an impossible thing to do. So motherhood's one. Disability is certainly one, though I will say that when I spoke with a lot of women, especially women who have visible disabilities, they spoke about the fact that disabled women are really only now in their middle age, meaning for so long, disabled women didn't have access to higher education. They didn't have access to professional workplaces. And so it's really sort of somewhere between your and my peer group that there are finally disabled women in the workplace. So there's not even a large body of work on it, but the immediate cultural assessment of a disabled person is that they are in some way less competent. And so they, especially then when a disabled woman advocates for herself, there is a real pushback because that is not what anyone expects. And so it shows up with disability. I mean, I had crazy stories about, a woman who was gay, worked in supply chain, wasn't totally out yet to everyone, and had to go to a male strip club with all of her female coworkers. And just like, she had to feign interest. And she remembers 30, 40 years later, how bizarre that was and how she had to like always be lying about a boyfriend she didn't have. And it's like, it is that death by 1,000 cuts, right? Where you're like constantly being forced to hide something about yourself or to minimize something about yourself just in order to get through the day.
And that really takes us to the tension between likability and authenticity. What are your feelings about authenticity? I mean, we all want to get to be who we are in the workplace. We all know that that comes with a cost, right? I mean, I'm the, silly woman who on occasion, mom of 4 kids, would just think I can't put on a suit today. And I would go to work in a pair of jeans and a t-shirt. And my boss would sort of look me up and down like, what were you thinking when you walked out the door? And I knew it. I knew that it was the wrong thing to do, but we all have our limits as human beings. And sometimes you just have to be who you are in that moment. What kind of a price tag does that carry for likability?
I mean, it is one of the catch-22s. I think there are multiple catch-22s here, which is that we say that the most likable and effective leaders are authentic leaders, but then we tell women that they can't show up authentically as themselves. And I think the jeans example is a great one. I think this also just really shows up very often at the intersection of race and gender, right? Like the way that a woman chooses to wear her hair, the jewelry that she chooses is appropriate for her workplace. You know, there are all of these subtle elements of self-styling in which you are choosing to tell someone who you are. I am a highly understylized person, so this is not my big challenge. But even there's a lot of research about people, two coworkers who each speak Spanish, actively choosing not to speak Spanish with each other in the workplace for fear of being coded. That someone who is Muslim and might do afternoon prayers, like, will never talk about it with their coworkers, will just link off because they don't want it to be underlined. And then just more broadly, like, this is the delicate dance of being in an office, right? Which is, I don't know that we want everyone just like showing up as their 100% uncontained self all the time. That sounds like a lot. I think what you want, though, is that people are able to bring the parts of themselves that they most value and the parts of themselves that they think are most useful to an office. Like, for example, I am a crier. I was a crier as a kid. I'm more or less a crier now. I feel like the early part of my career was a lot of learning not to cry in the workplace, that would be an instant demerit. And I now wish that I could. Do you know what I mean? Like, I actually think now that I'm a manager, now that I'm someone that other people look to for their cues, I think it would be perfectly fine to be like, I'm sorry, I'm really overwhelmed and I'm having a hard day. And that is more of, when I say authenticity, it's like you said, you knew jeans was like not in the context of what was appropriate, but that there's a lot of other behavior that is not apples to apples, right? Where someone else might get to cry or someone else might get, I think anger for women is a huge one. Like, men raise their voice all the time. Men get to lose it all the time. And most often it is dubbed as like, wow, he's having a really hard day, or wow, he feels really passionately about this project. It was the thing that all of the research brought out, which is when a woman is angry, it often gets marked as though something's wrong with her. Like, she is unhinged and she is an angry person, as opposed to she's just having a bad day or she just had a frustrating conversation. And that to me is like, if we're like, whatever we decide the level of anger that's appropriate in the workplace is, it should be equally extended to everyone.
So that's so true. And it resonates with me so much. As a brand new US attorney, I was up in Washington. Something had gone horribly wrong in my office. I mean, somebody had made a really bad mistake and his boss had not caught it. And I'm on the phone with my all male team and I'm pissed off and I raise my voice. And I've worked with these guys forever. They have never heard me raise my voice. And I sort of make my point. I say, you're going to get this fixed, right? And they say, right. And they think that I've hung up, but I'm actually still on, this conference call set up. And my number 2 guy, my deputy, my best friend in the office, says, ooh, mommy is mad at us. And I said, John, I'm still on the line. And fortunately, we were good enough friends that it was a huge laugh. And for years, somebody could say, John, I'm still on the line, to make the point. But it really, really made me think about the consequences as a woman of raising your voice. And, to your point about crying, like you, I'm a crier. Like you, I've spent years learning not to do it in the workplace. But there was that, I don't want to call it a wonderful moment. It was a horribly sad moment, an emotional moment, where Rachel Maddow was talking as the news about the migrant children being separated from their parents was becoming public knowledge. And she actually lost her composure on television talking about it. And I was really glad that she did. It was a moment where we were all losing our composure and trying to hold it together, and she sort of made it okay. But I think it's fascinating in context of the point that you make, that there are these rules that we throw up for ourselves sometimes, and maybe we don't always need them. So that sort of takes us to some of the solutions that you offer, I think, for this problem. What's your top tip? I mean, what can women do to avoid the likability trap?
Okay. So the vast majority of feedback that women get is critical subjective feedback, meaning if you have an annual review, most of it will be spent talking about your voice and your hair and how you sit and chair. And what we want to start doing is shifting, both as people who give feedback and as women who receive feedback, to feedback that is more results oriented. And so I think some really sort of easy, you can implement this today or tomorrow, is that if someone comes to you in a formal feedback or just on the fly and says, Joyce, I just think you're too assertive, that you would ask, compared to whom? Like, would you say that about John on our team? Is John on our team? I feel like he and I are about the same level of assertive. Is he more assertive? That might give the person an opportunity to further articulate what it is they mean. It might give them an opportunity to consider whether or not that characterization is marked by their own bias. The line I think is even, to me, like lands more easily for me is, thank you so much for that feedback. Can you draw a line for me from the feedback that you just gave me around my style to how it impacts the results of my work? And I think something that I always say is, it is possible that there is a connection. It is possible that I could say, you know, Joyce, I know you really pride yourself on being deliberate, but sometimes your being deliberate shows up as you're being indecisive. Just last week, we had a project that was due on Friday. There were a series of choices you had to make about what went in the deck. You didn't make them until Thursday. And as a result, we were 3 days late getting the deck to the client. Okay. Now there is at least some material for you as the person who's receiving that feedback to go back and say, did my failure to make a decision, the way that showed up there, did that actually impact the results of the work? And are there things that I can do to change that? If in our feedback session, I just say, Joyce, you're just really indecisive, what do you do with that? How do you put that into action? How do you make that actionable? So that, I think, is one thing. I think a lot of this is best done when other people do it for you. Is the truth, is sort of like the practical reality, that in as much as all of those things are good to say for yourself, I think it is even better when someone says it for you. That if I were to walk by someone and they were like, yeah, no, Melissa's really bossy, that I would say, well, would you call Jo bossy? You know, or I'd say, you know, is there a time where her quote unquote bossiness made it harder for you to do your job? Or is her bossiness changed the output of this team? And that there's also all this language shift that can happen that I know can feel very tedious and then make it feel like we're always watching our words. But even something I was struck by is, you know, something that you might think is a positive term, like helpful. That when you mark a woman as helpful, it often reduces her to being a helper. And if she's a helper, then she couldn't possibly be a leader. So that instead of saying, yeah, no, Jenna on our team is really helpful, you focus on what Jenna brought to the team. Jenna ran our regression analysis. Jenna did all of the numbers for the Q3 report. Jenna reached out to the 7 people that were invited to this event. You're very specific about what it is that a person is contributing. And then I am a huge believer in sponsorship. That's an idea from Sylviane Hewlett. We sort of all know about mentorship. I was raised sort of believing that the right mentor would unlock my entire career path. I think great mentors are great, but I also don't think there's any one solution like that. And the difference between a sponsor and a mentor is a sponsor delivers. A sponsor, introduces you to people, has a big Rolodex, introduces you to people. A sponsor connects you with opportunities, says, I just heard about this opening. I think you would be great for it. I want to introduce you to the person who can get you in the door over there. If you're within the same organization, they can give you a stretch assignment. I mean, the process of becoming a leader is like, we imagine it as like, oh, if I just do enough power poses, then I will become a leader. And the truth is, we step into leadership by being given opportunity to lead. Right? By being put on a stretch assignment, by even just something like leading a meeting, which is like, if you've never flexed that muscle, you don't know you can do it until you do it. And then once you do it, you know you can do it, and then you're more comfortable doing it the next time. So all of those little things. And then I did speak with someone, a technologist, who told me that she thought sponsorship was too transactional. And I take that critique, that there was too much of like, I will do this for you if you do this for me, because it is supposed to be a two-way relationship. But she had this thing that I just love, and I think you're big into, and I know Melissa's big into, which is, and the way she put it to me is bang the table for other women. Like that the next time you would be with someone from MSNBC, you'd be like, I just interviewed Alicia and wow, she really has thought a lot about this, or she has some really thoughtful things to say. And that, someone might say, I'm looking for this person, like I have exactly the right people. In fact, I have 3 people who might be perfect for you. That you're just constantly putting other women's names into contention for things, praising them, helping frame their leadership in ways that allow other people to see their strengths. So like that, I think is the bulk of it. That is all of the lowest hanging fruit, is to move away from subjective feedback into feedback that feels really results oriented and tangible. And then also thinking less about like, how do I show up? There are 96 people here. Everybody here has spent a good part of her life doing that. Okay, fine. What can we do in service to each other?
This helps to make it so concrete for me to think about what we can actually do. And this emerging notion of sponsorship as opposed to mentorship is really important. We all have big Rolodexes. I actually said that to my daughter the other day, my 22-year-old, and she didn't know what a Rolodex was, but we now all have iPhones full of contacts. And it is so very easy for us to help women get to where they need to be. That's what I ultimately take away from your book. We can advocate for ourselves, but we're so much more effective when we work together to get women to where they need to be. Is that an accurate takeaway?
I think that is, to me, that is like, that's the base. That's what we all can control. Really, institutions need to change to allow access. And that part of the challenge we're talking about is that takes lots of forms. Like, I think if you are talking with Black women who want to run for office in the Democratic Party, they will tell you that in districts that are, majority Black, the Democratic Party needs to begin clearing the field for Black women, right? Like that is very specific to that. But I think that is a good example of like, put your money where your mouth is. Like if you are serious about the fact that you want more Black women elected to office under the banner of democratic politics, then it is not enough to say that. You have to get involved in something as messy as a primary to actually make it happen. That if you are at, a corporation or an organization, that's like you need to be putting women in positions where they have the capacity to make decisions and change culture. And I think one of the hardest things to grapple with is this idea that to really have radical change, you can't just have women who are ascending into positions of power, who act the way that the white men who have had those positions of power before have always acted. That's not actually, that is a surface change. You need to create the space and the ability for all those people, for people of color, for white women to show up in their totality and to begin to change those notions of leadership, to be like, yeah, that's Joyce. She cries in her office every Friday. I don't know, whatever. Like, and that doesn't make me think any less of her as a leader, because at the end of the day, whatever it is, she has more billable hours than anybody on the team. So like, as long as she's not having a nervous breakdown, I don't really care why she's crying. Like, just some of the things that we've decided matter, I think are worth revisiting why they matter, so long as you are getting it done.
There is so much food for thought in all of this. I could go on asking you questions all day. And I hope that maybe we can get a drink in the post-COVID times and keep doing this. But I know that the audience has a lot of questions for you, and Abby is going to go ahead and ask some of them. So thank you so much, Alicia. Your answers, there's so much honesty in this and so much willingness to investigate your own beliefs. I really appreciate that. I've learned a lot from you today and from reading your book, and thank you for that. And on that note, Abby, let me turn it over to you for audience questions.
Absolutely. Thank you both so much. This has been a wonderful conversation. So one of our audience members has asked, how do we do a better job of talking about the likability trap and bias in environments that are not male dominated? She says she's spent a fair amount of her career surrounded by mostly women and is assertive and hard charging. And it wasn't an issue early and in the middle of her career, but as soon as she hit more senior positions, likability started showing up in performance reviews, even when she's surrounded by other women. So can you talk a little bit about how this shows up everywhere?
Yeah, and she is, thank you. You're not alone in having that experience. I also think there are additional dimensions to majority women workplaces. I spoke with one woman who worked in women's magazines, and she had a boss who told her that she wasn't being forthcoming enough with her personal life. She wanted a more sororal environment, and that was just not what this writer wanted to bring. And she, thought that that was very strange. So I think it is a lot of the same. I think it is a lot of the language and a lot of going back to the language. I think it is calling it out. And so I don't think any of that is particularly different, but I'm going to use the tee-up you've given me to talk about something else I think is really important, which is, I think once you've done all these things, once you've had the feedback session where you've done a bit of pushback, once you've pushed back on other people's behalfs, once you've flagged whatever you flagged, whomever needs to flag, I think there are a lot of us who stay places that are not fits for way longer than we ought to. And I always think having a critical eye toward, am I in the right organization? Meaning, are the skills that I bring and the results that I offer being valued? Sometimes you might be in the right organization, but in the wrong team. And sometimes it just may be that the opportunity that you need to grow is not there. I recognize that I'm talking at a time when we are in an economy that is not allowing for the type of mobility that one would hope for. Putting that reality temporarily aside, I spoke with a lot of women who, in order to break through that sort of middle management, senior management thing, really had to make a move and look at other organizations, and a lot of women who broke out on their own if they had the type of skill where that was possible, because it enabled them to then build the culture that they wanted to build. That I think there are people who are good inside players who know how to change culture from the inside. And then I think there are a lot of people who really need to sort of burn it all down and start all over again. And doing that self-assessment is I think part of the process.
Absolutely. So we also have questions about, or you were talking earlier about sort of it's better sometimes if some other people say it for you, calling out the bias and things like that. But where does that leave us with, I mean, we also have seen this research with women who luck into traditionally male positions of power not facing the same likability penalty as women who seek out power. So do we just have to rely on other people to do this for us? How can we start creating these new norms and new rules that?
I mean, yeah, totally. No, I think it is really important. It is a good question. I want to be thoughtful about how I answer this. You do not need to rely on other people to do it for you. And I do think that you can call it out where you see it. I think, though, the question sort of fundamentally underscores what it is that we are up against, and this idea that any one woman can get out from under it on her own. So there was all of this research. I'm going to guess that 50% of this group has either read Lean In or has read enough think pieces on Lean In that you feel like you read Lean In or you watch the TED Talk. You have the general idea. I actually found that there were a lot of pieces of Lean In that were very helpful and informed much of my own career. So I am grateful to Sheryl Sandberg for the parts that landed. Obviously, there are lots of parts that didn't and have received their proper critique. Part of what they have seen, though, is that because so much lady in the workplace literature has been built in that model of here's what you can do for yourself, here's how you can better advocate for yourself in a meeting, here's how you ask for a raise, is that has shifted the focus from the organization and the societal structure to the individual. And the problem with that is that individuals who've been exposed to those messages, both women who have read all of those books and men who are sort of vaguely familiar with them, begin to believe that both the problems and the solutions in a woman's career are of her own creation. That it absolves organizations and institutions of doing the work that they have to do. Because if you were just showing up and asking for a raise with a smile, then you would have gotten it. And that is not actually how it all works. And so, again, it would have been easy to be like, don't give a damn, be you. You then might get stuck in middle management forever. That's the reality of the world that we live in. That's not the world I want to live in, but that is the one that we are currently in. And so that's why I do think, all the things, you've read all the books, what you have to do. That's why the energy and emphasis has to begin to shift towards a bigger change.
So can I ask a question, Alicia? That last bit truly resonated with me. And I think this is something that we think about a lot in the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network. We are in a situation where we recognize the structural and systemic impediments to women's advancement. But we also recognize that there aren't a lot of women in some of those places of power who are in a position to begin dismantling those structural and institutional impediments on their own. So, one is a question about allyship with those who are in a position to do so. So how can we bring the men who are in power along so that they understand what the systemic barriers look like and how they are impeding women's progress? And, there's a terrific question in the chat about a male partner at a large New York firm who did not understand the trauma that sexual harassment can have on an employee and just assumed that anyone who couldn't stand up against sexual harassment was incapable of being a strong and zealous advocate on behalf of a client. So how do we deal with the men? And then how do we, again, sort of thread this balance? And I'm beginning to feel like it's almost a generational divide between middle-aged women like myself and the younger women like my daughter who are coming up, and all they want to talk about are systemic and institutional issues. And I get that, but I also recognize, you may have to accommodate some aspects of yourself so that you can get in the door and be in a position to begin dismantling some of that stuff.
I just want to fast forward to the part where we get drinks so that we can get into all of that on the other side of this. And I also what I hear from you, Melissa, is that I grew up in Union City, New Jersey. It is an immigrant community, and I didn't know that Latinos were a minority in this country until I went to a private high school. And then all of a sudden I was explaining why my friends had sweet 15s instead of sweet 16s. And it was my entire world just shifted. And I think whenever you have done the shape shifting of being a person who comes from a community of color and then is in majority white institutions, organizations like that high school, like for you, UVA, like Yale, it's you become the ultimate shapeshifter. And then I think the challenge for people like you and me is that then I'm well, why can't everyone shapeshift? Why isn't everyone making the constant accommodation that I am making all of the time, right? That is your daughter's no, I'm going to burn it down. You're maybe that's not how we have to do it. So when it comes to bringing people along, that is part of what I find the challenge to be, is that I then have to remember that their lived experience is not the same as my lived experience, and that the value to them is not as obvious as it is to me. I mean, I think that people who have come the farthest on this question, the people who have focused on the bottom line and the ways in which businesses and organizations thrive when there is, but you fundamentally have to have someone at the top who actually believes that, believes it in their core, is not pretending to believe. I almost think the organizations where the people at top, whomever they are pretending to believe in the value of diversity are almost more dangerous than any other organization, right? That it's either be a true believer, be all in, or don't talk the talk for the sake of talking the talk, because that is where I spoke with a lot of people who are well, my organization says this, but then we have these weird things happen inside that no one knows how to talk about or grapple with because they don't match the stated values of the place. So we're doing a lot of employee resource groups, but I'm not getting put on any major assignments. And that seems like the actual tell. I think this is the core question, which is even when I was selling the book and they would say, well, who is this book for? And I would say, it's for women. They'd be good, because women buy 10 books a year and men buy one. And then they would say, and women buy self-help books, and by self-help books, how can I change myself and how can I change the world? And men don't. So that is a big part of what, it's why I focus so much, because I know that so often my audience is women, in making sure that white women at least understand the power that we have within these structures to be some of these agents of change and some of these messengers, because there is still very often, there are more white women in power in these organizations who are closer and in proximity to the white men that are in power, who can be messengers on these things. And you have to be like, you have to be a messenger, not only on behalf of yourself, but on behalf of everybody else, which I get is like yet another layer on this thing where it's like, here are all your responsibilities, here are your unstated responsibilities, and here are the diversity events. But I think this is the core question. I don't know that I have a great answer for it. But if you do, I would love to hear for you, how you recruit allies.
Well, I'm just so excited about, like Joyce, being able to ask you questions instead of you asking me questions all the time that I'm not always prepared to answer. So this has been a treat. But I think this is really sort of the fundamental question. And one of the things that we're trying to do at the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network is to sort of think about the conditions for cultivating women's leadership. But those conditions are also about, normalizing women's leadership for a world that maybe hasn't been used to it. And, I think a lot about what happened on January 6th at the Capitol. And, for me, at least, you can understand that as a failure of democracy or a challenge to democratic norms. I think you can also understand it as a profound discomfort with the idea of women in leadership roles, like really significant leadership roles, like Nancy Pelosi or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And if viewed through that lens, this whole moment, maybe even the last 4 years, might be about the anxiety of a model of leadership that we have been so familiar with evolving and changing. And I think the question for us at the law school is, how do we normalize that so people are more comfortable with it and it doesn't feel so disruptive, and the conditions are better for women when they do step into those roles?
And that is why part of my theory, which is like totally unsatisfying, has been that you just need to see people do it. Like, it's why something that can feel just zeitgeisty, like AOC, going to the House floor to talk about being called the B word, like that to me is actually much more significant than it was treated as being. That it's like, she was called it, she then had a choice to make, which is if she goes to the floor and talks about this, she reminds everyone that it happened. She becomes like the person who is, again, by identifying the problem, often becomes the problem. That was the gamble that she was taking by standing up and calling it out. And part of what I found powerful about that moment is that by her being brave enough to do that, by her making the calculus that she had enough political capital to get that done, all of the generation of women behind her who wanted to be like, well, actually, now that she's sharing that story, I want to share a story too. And then it became less about the individual then and more about the shared experience of this thing. And I think just like the doing, I really did find it very, very powerful when Stacey Abrams and Val Demings and all of them were like, yeah, no, here's why I should be vice president. Like, that to me was a radical moment where like that to me was shape shifting for women across the board. And again, it wasn't because we were sitting in a conference talking about it. It's just because they were like, boom, out there on George Stephanopoulos saying they wanted it. And it meant, and I also think because they all did it, it meant that we didn't get slotted into playing this like, well, is Val playing it right? Or is Stacey playing it right? Just like, nope, like they are uniformly doing this. And that makes it less of an individual character question and more of a just like, this is clearly the way to go. Even just the fact that we're talking less about Harris's family. Like, I think the fact that that sort of is like a, it's been written about, but it has not been belabored the way that it has been belabored in other campaigns.
Thank you. This has been such a wonderful conversation. I recognize we're a little over time, so we would happily spend the entire night continuing to talk with you, but recognize that we all have things to get back to, particularly our wonderful panelists. So thank you so much again for being here, for writing your book, and for joining us today. For anyone in the audience who doesn't have the book yet, you can find a link to purchase it on our website, and which will be in the chat shortly. And we hope you'll join us for more events at the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network soon. Thank you again.